The concrete wall rose 8 feet high across Sarah's beloved creek, the sound of rushing water replaced by ominous silence. Behind her stood Richard Blackwood, HOA president, arms crossed with a smug smile. "Try to stop me," he sneered. But what Richard didn't know was that Sarah Chen wasn't just a homeowner. She was an environmental lawyer who'd been waiting 3 years for the perfect case to destroy him. And blocking a protected waterway? That was exactly the ammunition she needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Sarah Chen stepped onto her back deck, coffee mug in hand. The familiar symphony of her creek should have greeted her, the gentle babble of water over stones, the rustle of cattails, the splash of a heron fishing. Instead, she heard nothing. Silence. Her bare feet hit the dew-soaked grass as she ran, toward the back of her property, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sight that greeted her stopped her cold. A concrete wall, 8 feet of gray industrial brutality slicing across her creek like a knife through silk. The water that had flowed freely for centuries now pooled in stagnant defeat on one side, while the other lay bone dry, revealing the creekbed's wounded stones for the first time in living memory. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, her coffee mug slipping from numb fingers to shatter on the rocks below. "Morning, neighbor!" She spun to find Richard Blackwood standing at the property line, his perfectly pressed khakis and polo shirt making him look like a country club advertisement. At 62, the HOA president had the kind of artificially maintained appearance that screamed money and entitlement. Silver hair slicked back, teeth too white, tan too even. "Richard, what is this?" Sarah's voice shook with barely contained fury. "Flood control." He smiled, the expression never reaching his cold blue eyes. "The board voted last night. Emergency measures to protect the community from potential water damage." "This is my property line. You can't just—" "Actually, I can." Richard pulled out his phone, swiping to a document. "HOA Covenant 47B. The association reserves the right to take necessary action to protect property values and community safety. Your little creek has been deemed a liability." Sarah snatched the phone, scanning the legal text. Her law degree hadn't prepared her for this moment, not because she didn't understand the covenant, but because she couldn't believe the audacity. "This doesn't give you the right to destroy a natural waterway." "Says who?" Richard's smile widened. "You gonna sue me, Sarah? With what money?" "We both know how much environmental lawyers make." The words hit like a physical blow. 3 years ago, when Sarah had moved to Willowbrook Estates, she'd been riding high on her success as a corporate attorney. Big salary, bigger cases, and enough arrogance to buy the most expensive house in the development. Then her world imploded. The Blackwood Industries case, her former firm's biggest client, and Richard's company. When Sarah discovered they'd been illegally dumping chemicals into wetlands for decades, she'd done what she thought was right. She'd blown the whistle. The firm fired her within a week. Richard's connections ensured she'd never work corporate. Law again. Now she scraped by taking environmental cases for nonprofits, living off her savings while her expensive house slowly drained her accounts. "I see that look," Richard continued, stepping closer. "Still thinking about that little tantrum you threw 3 years ago? How'd that work out for you? People's lives were at stake. And now your precious creek is at stake. Funny how things come full circle." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I told you then that I'd make you pay for what you cost me. Consider this the first installment." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The creek had been her sanctuary, the reason she'd bought this house. After her father's death, after the career implosion, after her marriage fell apart under the financial stress, this place had been her refuge. The sound of flowing water had been her therapy, her meditation, her connection to something larger than the mess her life had become. "You son of a bitch." "Careful, Sarah. That's the president of your homeowners association you're talking to." Richard chuckled, turning to leave. "Oh, and don't think about tearing it down. The concrete's reinforced, and any damage to HOA property will result in immediate fines. Have a wonderful day." As his footsteps faded, Sarah stood alone beside. the monstrous wall. She pressed her palm against the concrete, feeling the cold roughness against her skin. Behind the barrier, she could hear the creek trying to flow, the water searching desperately for its ancient path. Her phone buzzed, a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived upstream. "Sarah, honey, my basement is flooding. The water has nowhere to go since they put up that wall. Do you know what's happening?" Then another text from Jim Morrison downstream. "The fish in my pond are all dead. No fresh water coming in. What the hell did they do to the creek?" Sarah's pulse quickened. Environmental damage. That was something she understood, something she could fight. She pulled out her laptop and began documenting everything. Photos of the wall, the stagnant water, the dry creek bed. She called Mrs. Patterson and Jim, taking detailed statements about the flooding and fish kill. By noon, she had enough. Evidence to make Richard very, very sorry. Her phone rang as she finished uploading the photos to her cloud storage. "Sarah Chen." "Ms. Chen, this is Detective Maria Santos with the County Environmental Crimes Unit. We've received several reports about illegal obstruction of a waterway in your neighborhood. I understand you're an environmental attorney?" Sarah's heart leaped. "That's correct. I was just about to file a complaint myself." "Excellent. We'd like to meet with you this afternoon. From what I'm hearing, this could be a significant case. The creek in question, Mill Creek, it's actually classified as a protected waterway under state environmental statutes. Blocking it isn't just an HOA matter, it's a felony." "A felony?" Sarah could barely contain her excitement. "Oh yes. Minimum 5 years, maximum 20. Plus federal charges if we can prove environmental terrorism. The EPA takes waterway obstruction very seriously these days." After hanging up, Sarah walked back to the wall. She placed both hands against the concrete and smiled for the first time in 3 years. "You have no idea what you've just done. Richard," she whispered to the silent barrier, "but you're about to find out." Her phone buzzed with another call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was unmistakable. "Sarah?" Richard sounded different, smaller. "We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding about the creek situation." Sarah's smile widened as she watched a white SUV with government plates pull into Richard's driveway. 2 officers in uniforms got out, along with a woman in a suit carrying a briefcase. "I'm sorry, Richard. I'm a little busy right now, but I'm sure those nice people walking up to your door would love to chat." She hung up and watched through her kitchen window as Detective Santos knocked on Richard Blackwood's door, warrant in hand. Richard Blackwood's hands trembled as he opened his front door to find Detective Santos, flanked by 2 environmental enforcement officers. The confident smirk he'd worn just hours earlier had vanished, replaced by the pale complexion of a man who'd just realized he'd stepped in quicksand. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Detective Santos, County Environmental Crimes Unit. We have a warrant to search your property and examine the concrete structure you erected across Mill Creek." "There's been a mistake," Richard stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "It's just a simple flood control measure. The HOA..." "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside." Detective Santos pushed past him, her team already moving toward the backyard. "Mill Creek is classified as a protected waterway under the Clean Water Act. What you've done here isn't just illegal, it's a federal crime." From her kitchen window, Sarah watched the scene unfold with savage satisfaction. She'd spent the morning researching, and what she'd found made her blood sing with anticipation. Mill Creek wasn't just any waterway, it was a critical spawning ground for native trout, a designated wetland buffer, and part of a watershed that fed into the state's largest reservoir. Richard had inadvertently declared war on the entire ecosystem. Her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman in a navy suit holding a badge. "Ms. Chen, I'm Agent Jessica Walsh, EPA Criminal Investigation Division, Detective. Santos told me you're the environmental attorney in the neighborhood." Sarah opened the door, her heart racing. "That's right. Come in." Agent Walsh stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the wall of legal texts and environmental law books that lined Sarah's living room. Impressive collection. Georgetown Law? Harvard, actually. Environmental Law Review, class of '09. Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee. Though I haven't been practicing much environmental law lately, corporate firms don't exactly welcome whistleblowers. I heard about the Blackwood Industries case. That took guts. Walsh accepted the coffee gratefully. The cleanup of those wetlands is still ongoing. You saved a lot of lives. Cost me my career, though. Maybe. Or maybe it led you exactly where you needed to be. Walsh gestured toward the window, where they could see Richard pacing frantically, in his backyard while investigators photographed the wall. Tell me everything you know about this situation. Sarah spent the next hour walking Walsh through the timeline. Richard's threats, the overnight construction, the immediate environmental damage. She showed her photos of the flooding upstream, the fish kill downstream, and the completely stagnant water trapped behind the concrete barrier. This is incredibly thorough documentation, Walsh said, scrolling through Sarah's files. You've essentially built our case for us. I had good motivation. I'll bet. But there's something else you should know. Walsh leaned forward. This morning we received an anonymous tip about Blackwood Industries. Someone sent us internal documents showing they've been illegally dumping construction waste in protected wetlands for the past 18 months. Sarah nearly dropped her coffee cup. 18 months? But the settlement from 3 years ago apparently didn't stop them. They just got better at hiding it. Walsh's smile was sharp. The documents show systematic violations. Falsified environmental impact reports, bribed inspectors, illegal waste disposal. It's a prosecutor's dream. How does this connect to the creek? The concrete for that wall? It came from Blackwood Industries' plant, the same plant that's been dumping contaminated materials. Which means that wall isn't just an illegal obstruction, it's potentially a toxic hazard. Sarah felt the room spin. Toxic materials in the creek? We'll know for sure after the lab results come back, but preliminary tests show elevated levels of heavy metals in the concrete. If that leaches into the water system, Walsh shook her head. We're talking about potential contamination of the entire watershed. Through the window they watched as hazmat-suited technicians arrived and began taking water samples. Richard stood in his backyard, his face ashen, watching his world crumble in real time. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her ex-husband. Saw the news vans on TV. What's happening at your place? News vans. Sarah looked out front to see 3 news trucks setting up, reporters checking their equipment. Her quiet neighborhood was about to become a circus. Agent Walsh, I need to ask you something. What are Richard's potential charges? Environmental terrorism, illegal obstruction of a waterway, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and if the concrete is contaminated, potentially bioterrorism. We're talking about life in prison if convicted on all counts. Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard's number. Answer it, Walsh suggested, and put it on speaker. Sarah! Richard's voice was desperate, cracking with panic. You have to help me. Tell them this was a misunderstanding. The board approved it. Richard, did the board approve you using potentially contaminated concrete from your own company? Silence. Then, did you really think I wouldn't investigate? I may not be corporate law anymore, but I'm still a damn good attorney. Sarah, please, we can work this out. I'll tear down the wall. I'll compensate you for damages. Name your price. Agent Walsh shook her head, making a slashing motion across her throat. It's too late for that, Richard. The EPA is involved now. The State Environmental Crimes Unit, the FBI. Sarah's voice was steady, professional. You committed federal crimes, multiple felonies. There's no negotiating your way out of this. You don't understand. The company, my investors, if this gets out, I'll lose everything. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to get revenge on me by destroying a protected ecosystem. A crash came through the phone line, followed by cursing. Richard, you still there? Agent Walsh raised an eyebrow. They're arresting me, Richard whispered. Federal agents. They're reading me my rights. Through the window, Sarah watched as FBI agents led Richard Blackwood away in handcuffs. News cameras captured every moment as the once powerful HOA president was stuffed into the back of a federal vehicle. "Sarah?" Richard's voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The line went dead. Agent Walsh closed her laptop and stood. "Ms. Chen, I want to make you an offer. The EPA could use someone with your expertise and your passion for environmental justice. We're opening a new division focused on corporate environmental crimes. Interested?" Sarah looked out at the wall that had seemed so insurmountable that morning. Already, a crew was setting up to begin demolition. By evening, her creek would be flowing free again. "What's the salary?" "Triple what you're making now, plus full benefits and a chance to prosecute the kind of cases that actually matter." Sarah smiled, watching the news reporters interview her flooded neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was telling them about the environmental lawyer who'd saved their neighborhood. "Agent Walsh, you've got yourself a deal." As Walsh left, Sarah's phone exploded with messages, environmental groups wanting to hire her, law firms begging her to consult, reporters requesting interviews. The story was going viral. HOA president's revenge backfires spectacularly. But the message that made her smile the most was from her father's old fishing buddy. "Sarah, your dad would be so proud. You just caught the biggest fish of your career." She walked to her back deck and watched as the demolition crew began dismantling Richard's wall. The first chunk of concrete fell away, and she heard it, the sweetest sound in the world, water flowing free. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the federal courthouse wearing her sharpest suit, a stack of evidence boxes beside her. The preliminary hearing for United States versus Richard Blackwood had drawn a packed gallery. Environmental activists, local residents, and a small army of reporters. But it was the man sitting in the defendant's chair who held her attention. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in 14 days. His silver hair was unkempt, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Gone was the arrogant HOA president who'd smirked at her across the ruined creek. In his place sat a broken man facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built. "Your Honor," federal prosecutor Amanda Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, stood to address the court. "The evidence in this case reveals a conspiracy that goes far beyond the illegal obstruction of Mill Creek. The defendant's actions represent a systematic assault on environmental protections that spans multiple states and endangered thousands of lives." Sarah watched from the gallery as the prosecutor laid out the case. The contaminated concrete wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a deliberate scheme to dispose of toxic waste. Internal documents showed Richard had been selling contaminated concrete to construction projects across 3 states, including schools and hospitals. The defendant's wall across Mill Creek was merely the tip of the iceberg, Prosecutor Chen continued. "We have evidence of over 40 construction projects that used contaminated materials from Blackwood Industries. The potential health impacts are staggering." Richard's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Steinberg, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client was unaware of any contamination. He relied on his plant managers to ensure proper procedures." "Mr. Steinberg," Judge Patricia Huang interrupted, "I have here a recorded phone conversation between your client and his plant manager from 6 months ago. Would you like me to play it?" Sarah leaned forward. This was new evidence. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with Richard's voice. "I don't care if the concrete tests show heavy metals. We've got $3 million in inventory to move. Find a way to make it pass inspection, or I'll find someone who will." The plant manager's voice responded, "Sir, if we use this concrete in construction, it could leach toxins into groundwater." "Not my problem. Our problem is cash flow. Ship it." The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Sarah felt her stomach clench. This wasn't just environmental crime, it was premeditated poisoning. "Furthermore," Judge Huang continued, "the EPA has identified 12 separate water systems that show contamination consistent with materials from Blackwood Industries. The town of Millbrook has already reported 7 cases of childhood leukemia, potentially linked to contaminated concrete in their elementary school foundation." Sarah's blood ran cold. Children. Richard's greed had endangered children. During the recess, she stepped outside for air and found herself face to face with Richard himself. His attorney had stepped away, leaving him alone on the courthouse steps. "Sarah." His voice was barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something. You shouldn't be talking to me without your lawyer present." "My lawyer's gonna drop me. They all are. I can't pay legal fees when all my assets are frozen." Richard's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "The company's bankrupt. The board kicked me out. My wife filed for divorce yesterday." "I'm sorry for your family," Sarah said carefully. "But you did this to yourself." I know. He took a shaky drag. "But that's not why I wanted to talk to you. There's something else. Something the prosecutors don't know yet." Sarah felt a chill. "Richard, whatever it is, the contaminated concrete wasn't an accident. It wasn't even about money." His eyes met hers, and she saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. "It was about you." "What do you mean?" "After you destroyed my company 3 years ago, after the lawsuits and the cleanup costs, I wanted revenge. But not just against you, against everyone who supported environmental protection, against the whole system that let one person destroy everything I'd built." Sarah's mind raced. "You contaminated construction projects to get back at environmentalists?" "I wanted to create a crisis. Something so big that the public would turn against environmental regulations. I figured if enough people got sick, if enough communities were affected, they'd blame the regulations for not preventing it instead of blaming the companies." The twisted logic made Sarah's stomach turn. "You poisoned children to make a political point?" "I never meant for kids to get hurt. I thought the contamination would be minor, just enough to cause a scare. But the levels were higher than I expected, and the concrete was used in more projects than I planned." Richard's voice broke. "Sarah, I'm a monster. What I did to get back at you, it's going to kill people." "How many projects? How many sites?" "Over 200, across 6 states. Schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, shopping centers." Tears streamed down his face. "And the worst part? The wall I built across your creek? That was just the beginning. I was going to contaminate your whole neighborhood's water supply. I wanted to destroy your sanctuary the way you destroyed mine." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Richard, you have to tell the prosecutors everything, right now." "I can't. They'll add domestic terrorism charges. I'll never see daylight again." "Children are dying. You don't get to choose your consequences now." "Ms. Chen?" Agent Walsh appeared behind them. "Is everything all right?" Richard looked at Sarah, then at Agent Walsh, then back at Sarah. "I want to make a deal. Full confession in exchange for a guarantee that I'll be placed in protective custody. I know too much about too many people. If word gets out that I'm cooperating..." "What kind of information?" Walsh asked. 15 years of bribing environmental inspectors. A network of companies across the country doing the same thing. Senators who took money to vote against environmental regulations. Judges who dismissed lawsuits for cash payments. Richard's voice grew stronger. "I kept records of everything. Insurance, I called it. I never thought I'd need to use it." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't just about Richard or even his company. This was about systemic corruption that reached the highest levels of government. "Agent Walsh," she said quietly, "I think you're going to need to call Washington." 3 hours later, FBI Director Morrison himself arrived at the courthouse. The building was sealed, reporters were pushed back 3 blocks, and Richard Blackwood was transferred to a secure location to begin what would become the largest environmental corruption investigation in U.S. history. Sarah stood at the courthouse steps as the sun set, watching the last of the federal vehicles disappear into the distance. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, but she ignored them all except one. "Sarah, it's Detective Santos. I wanted to give you a heads up. Based on Blackwood's information, we're about to execute simultaneous raids on 47 locations across 6 states. Companies, government offices, private residences. This is going to be national news." "How many people are we talking about?" "Potentially hundreds of arrests. Senators, judges, corporate executives, lobbyists. Sarah, what started with your Creek complaint is about to bring down the largest environmental corruption ring in American history. After hanging up, Sarah walked to her car and drove home in the gathering darkness. The news vans were still there, but she ignored them and went straight to her backyard. Mill Creek flowed freely now, its gentle voice restored. The concrete was gone, the banks were healing, and she could see the first signs of wildlife returning. But as she stood there listening to the water, she realized something profound had changed. This wasn't just about her creek anymore. This wasn't even about Richard's revenge. Somehow, her small neighborhood dispute had become the key to exposing a conspiracy that threatened environmental protections across the entire country. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Ms. Chen, this is Senator Elizabeth Warren. I've been following your case, and I think we need to talk. 6 months later, Sarah stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, facing a panel of senators and a gallery packed with environmental advocates, corporate executives, and families of contamination victims. The hearing room buzzed with tension as she adjusted her microphone and looked directly at Senator Warren, who had become her unlikely ally in the fight for environmental justice. Ms. Chen, Senator Warren began, thanks to your initial complaint about a creek in your backyard, federal investigators have uncovered what they're calling the largest environmental corruption scandal in U.S. history. Can you walk us through how a simple property dispute led to this moment? Sarah glanced at the gallery, where she spotted Mrs. Patterson sitting next to the mother of a young leukemia victim from Millbrook. In the back row, barely visible, sat Richard Blackwood in his orange prison jumpsuit flanked by federal marshals. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something she'd never expected: gratitude. Senator Warren, it started with silence, Sarah began. When I woke up that morning and couldn't hear my creek flowing, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. But I had no idea that investigating that wrongness would reveal a conspiracy that put millions of Americans at risk. Over the next hour, Sarah detailed the investigation that had consumed her life. The wall across Mill Creek had been just the beginning. Richard's cooperation had led to the discovery of the concrete conspiracy, a network of companies, politicians, and regulators who had systematically undermined environmental protections for over a decade. The evidence shows, Sarah continued, that Blackwood Industries was part of a larger scheme involving 47 companies across 6 states. They deliberately contaminated construction materials, bribed inspectors to approve toxic projects, and paid politicians to vote against environmental regulations. When communities got sick, they used their media connections to blame regulatory failures rather than corporate malfeasance. Senator John Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, leaned forward. Ms. Chen, while these allegations are serious, don't you think there's a danger in using one man's vendetta to paint the entire construction industry as corrupt? Sarah had expected this question. Senator Hawley, I understand your concern, but the evidence isn't based on one man's testimony. Federal investigators have recovered over 10,000 documents, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, and financial records showing millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks. This isn't about one company or one industry. It's about a systematic assault on the laws that protect our air, water, and public health. She gestured to the gallery. The families here today represent just a fraction of the victims. The Millbrook elementary school contamination has resulted in 14 cases of childhood cancer. The Riverside apartments in Ohio have been evacuated due to toxic groundwater. A hospital in Texas had to be demolished because its foundation was leaching arsenic into the water supply. The hearing room fell silent. But here's what makes this case unique, Sarah continued. The conspiracy didn't just aim to hide environmental crimes. It aimed to use environmental disasters to destroy environmental protections altogether. The plan was to create public health crises, then blame government regulations for failing to prevent them. It was environmental terrorism disguised as deregulation advocacy. Senator Warren nodded grimly. And Mr. Blackwood has agreed to testify about this conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence? He has. And his testimony has already led to the indictment of 3 sitting senators, 12 federal judges, and over 200 corporate executives. The Justice Department estimates that the cleanup and medical costs from this conspiracy will exceed $50 billion. In the gallery, Sarah saw Agent Walsh give her a subtle thumbs up. The EPA's new Environmental Crimes Division, which Sarah now headed, had become the most powerful environmental enforcement agency in the country's history. "Ms. Chen," Senator Hawley pressed, "what assurance do we have that this new enforcement regime won't become a weapon against legitimate businesses?" Sarah smiled, thinking of her morning routine, walking to her back deck, listening to Mill Creek flow freely, watching the herons that had returned to nest in the restored cattails. "Senator, I spent years as a corporate attorney. I understand the concerns of legitimate businesses. But what we learned from this case is that the biggest threat to honest companies isn't environmental regulation. It's environmental corruption. When criminals can buy their way out of compliance, they gain an unfair advantage over companies that follow the law." She stood up, her voice growing stronger. 3 years ago, I lost my career for exposing environmental crimes. I was told. I was naive that I didn't understand how the real world worked. But what I learned is that the real world some people describe, where money can buy exemptions from laws designed to protect public health, isn't the world we have to accept. The gallery erupted in applause. Senator Warren had to gavel for order. "The restoration of Mill Creek has become a symbol," Sarah continued, "not just of environmental recovery, but of what happens when ordinary citizens refuse to accept corruption as normal. That creek flows freely today because people like Mrs. Patterson and Jim Morrison refused to accept that their flooded basements and dead fish were the price of progress." She looked directly at Richard in the back row. "And yes, because Richard Blackwood ultimately chose to tell the truth, even though it cost him everything. That's the real lesson here, that redemption is possible, but only when we're willing to face the consequences of our actions." After the hearing, Sarah walked through the Capitol building toward the exit. The marble halls that had once intimidated her now felt familiar, welcoming. She'd testified before Congress 17 times in the past 6 months, helping to craft new environmental enforcement legislation that would bear her name, the Chen Environmental Protection Act. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the National Mall. Her phone buzzed with a text from her ex-husband. "Watched. The hearing. Dad would have been proud. You found your calling." Another text from Agent Walsh. "Congratulations, Director Chen. The President wants to meet with you next week about the new EPA budget." Director Chen. Sarah still couldn't believe it. The woman who'd been blacklisted from corporate law was now the most powerful environmental prosecutor in the country. But the text that made her smile was from Mrs. Patterson. "Sarah, dear, the herons are back. 3 pairs nesting in the creek. Thought you'd want to know." Sarah drove home through the Virginia countryside, past construction sites where EPA inspectors now had unprecedented authority to shut down projects using contaminated materials. Past schools where children could drink from water fountains without fear. Past the Millbrook Elementary site, where a memorial garden grew where the contaminated building once stood. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah saw someone sitting on her back deck. For a moment, her heart raced, memories of threats and confrontations flooding back. Then she recognized the figure. It was Richard Blackwood, but not the Richard she'd known. This man was thinner, grayer, wearing simple civilian clothes instead of a prison uniform. His federal cooperation had earned him early release to a halfway house, and he was scheduled to begin his court-ordered community service at environmental cleanup sites. "Sarah," he said as she approached, "I know I'm not supposed to be here. My parole officer doesn't know I came, but I needed to see it." "See what?" "The creek. What it looks like now." They walked together to the water's edge, where Mill Creek flowed clear and strong. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, hunting for fish that had returned when the ecosystem healed. "I destroyed so much," Richard said quietly. "Hundreds of sites, thousands of lives, but this place, it's beautiful again." "It is. I'll never forgive myself for what I did. But seeing this, it gives me hope that maybe some of the damage can be repaired." Sarah watched the heron step delicately through the water, patient and precise. "Richard, what you did was unforgivable, but what you're doing now, the testimony, the cooperation, the cleanup work, that matters too. The Prosecutors think I'll live long enough to see maybe 10% of the contaminated sites cleaned up. The rest will take decades if they can be cleaned up at all. Then we'd better get started. They stood in silence as the sun set over the restored wetland. The sound of flowing water mixed with the evening calls of birds, frogs, and insects that had returned to claim their ancient home. "Sarah," Richard said finally, "I have a confession. When I built that wall, I thought I was destroying your sanctuary. But what I actually did was give you the weapon you needed to save everyone's sanctuary." Sarah smiled, watching the heron spread its wings and lift off into the gathering dusk. Sometimes the thing that's meant to destroy us becomes the thing that sets us free. As Richard walked away toward his court-ordered transportation, Sarah remained by the creek. Her phone buzzed with emails from environmental groups, legal briefs from her staff, and interview requests from reporters. But she ignored them all and listened to the sound that had changed her life. Water, flowing free. The creek that had been silenced by corruption now sang with the voice of justice restored. And in that song, Sarah heard the future. A future where environmental protection wasn't just about